Today we are going to talk about important concept with respect to component. So components are the building blocks of any ab initio architecture or ab initio graphs or plans, right? So we are so this is basic actually. So but there were a few queries coming up in my video comments. Then I thought of creating few videos based on component properties. So let's talk about some of the properties today. And in the following videos, we are going to talk about another properties. So there are, if you look at the particular components, so there are different properties associated with a particular component. So most of the properties, I mean, those sections are same, but depending upon the components, they could vary bit. I mean, there could be an access tab in one of the component, but may not be in other component, right? So I would be talking about all the properties, which is going to be a superset of all those properties, and we will be seeing few example components wherein these properties are associated with. Okay, so whenever you select one component from the component organizer in the ab initio library, right, component library, so there will be a description of that component and then data, and then data would be associated with the only those components which are basically the starting point of the group, meaning starting point and end points like input file or input table or output file or output table or probably the intermediate file as well, and maybe lookup. So for all those components, there will be a data tab. I mean the data properties and access properties. How these data which is residing in that particular file component or table component can be accessed. Okay. So with respect, and then there will be parameters. This is also one of the properties in component, and we will be going into detail how the parameters we should configure, and what are the different interpretation of those parameters. And then there is another property is layout. So layout is a very important property, which which is signifies the where the particular component is going to run. So it's very important. Then there are ports. Ports in the sense of how particular component holding the records at input and output. Okay, so that we detail into the DML, or we assign some ports. Okay, for that. Then there is a condition. So we can at runtime we can we can skip that particular component, or we can conditionalize the running of that particular component. Rather, we need to run that component depending on the runtime conditions. So these are the most of the properties of a particular component. So today I think we shall talk about a couple of properties. Let's say description and data. So I will switch over to the another another document which I have prepared to show you guys. So first of all, what is the component? So this is the isolated process within a graph or or a set of graphs. When you look at one component, so what is that component? So when we want to perform any particular task, let's say we want to sort the data, let's say, then we will pull the sort component, and that component would be running. So whenever we are running that particular component, let's say we are running multiple components, maybe serially, or maybe pipeline parallelism, pipeline graph, or the that particular component is going to be run isolated. So it's not going to talk to different component while processing. Okay, let's say we have a reformat component, then there is an sort component following that. So the reformat component, it is going to be processed isolatedly, and it is going to be processed at some location. Okay, that we are going to talk about later, where that component is going to be write its work related files and all. So a particular component is an isolated process. So if we talk about multi, let's say if a sort component is running on M-way multi-way or 8-way multi-way. Okay, so those 8 different processes is going to be created, and all those processes will be isolated from each other, so they are not going to talk to each other while processing. Okay, but whenever the process ends, all the data would be, going to the output, and then the output flow would be also, multi-way. So each and every partition is going to flow on the way, okay, to the next component. So basically the component is an isolated process, the basic building block of the process. Okay, so let's now talk about the properties of the components. So when we drag any component from the component library into our graph, then there are multiple properties we need to configure so that or that particular component should be, accessing our data and work what how we want it to be working. Okay, so let's say so there is a property which is called description. So it isn't, this is not a functional property, it's an, labeling and or what should be the label of the component. Now it is important because whenever we label the component, it should, for readability and, to understand, after the development, to improve the maintainability of the graph, we should label the particular component, uh, with the consideration that everybody can understand. So let's say we are labeling the reformat component, so we should know what reformat does in brief. Like we are assigning some, we are calculating some transaction value, so we can say calculate the transaction value. Let's say, okay, we can label it as RFMT sort and calculate value, like that. If you describe like this, then everybody can understand. While not they may not be opening the component, but while looking at it, they can understand it, what the reformat component does basically. So that we can put into the label. Then the author and, those properties where that component is residing in the library, and other comments, descriptive comments, you can so the label and the description you can change. So this is not a kind of function, but it's very important to label a particular component. Partially you can name the component, and then what that component does you can describe over here. Then there is a data property. So data property may not be available for all the components, but it is applicable only for inputs and outputs. So if you look at the data tab so I have took the snippet of one of the components. So this is the description, data, access, port, and condition. This is an input file basically. Okay. So within an input file, if you go to the data section, then first property would be reusable datasets. So if you know, whenever we do the dependency analysis, right, we create the datasets beforehand. So if that particular dataset is going to be used in multiple graphs or multiple projects, then we can create the dataset beforehand, and we can use that dataset whenever it is required. So let's say any we have to read the customer data in our revenue application, and the same customer data could be accessed in another application. Okay, maybe finance application. So customer data is going to be same, but we can create a reusable data set into the one of the public sandbox, and that public sandbox can be can be included into the multiple private sandbox. Let's say finance sandbox or revenue sandbox, like that. So we can define that customer data as a reusable data sets, and we can, whenever we click on this, then there will be a browser button is going to become, and we can browse that data set going to the proper location. Okay. Then there is a data location. In data location, we can specify the URL. There are different ways of specifying the URL. Like If it is a serial file, then we just specify file and the location of that particular file. If it is a multi-file, then M file and column. Okay. Then there is a file. So if we are dealing with the SDFS, then there will be SDFS and then column, then the location. If we are talking about AWS, then there will be S3A, okay, and then there is a S3 bucket name, and then the location of the file. So, and also if we are dealing with the dynamic layouts, okay, dynamic layouts. When we make our graph running in SDFS environment, right? Yarn, yet another resource uh, allocator, right? So in SDFS applications, whenever our graph is running in multiple nodes, then in those situations, or graph would be running in SDFS environment. So then we could use the dynamic layout. So whenever we specify the dynamic layout, so then there will be a M file, then dynamic layout, and depth of the layout. So depth of the layout, let's say we have run, and then there will be a path. Okay, and if it is a dynamic layout which is changing layout, then we specify -1. So in Kubernetes and all, right, in containerized application, whenever we create the container from our graph, and we make our run graph dynamically, and also we don't know the depth of the component which is running at beforehand. So we make it as a dynamic, and Kubernetes would be deciding dynamically at runtime where these components or where should be running. So these are the maybe a little bit advanced. So I have just given the description of this currently, because we are talking about the data, where how we can configure this URL for different situations, or for different data, which is whether it is in serial, whether it is in different host, or whether it is in local or cloud, or all these. So there could be a in Google or Microsoft Azure blob storage. Okay, so there are different different allocator for that. So S3A, and for Google it's Google storage GS, I think, and for Azure blob storage it is an WASB or something. Okay, so this is how we can configure our data layout, data URL. Okay, so now, and one, so there are two ways of specifying it URL like that. If we have a multiple partition, let's say we are working as a four-way, we want to prepare a four-way, and we have 4 serial files. We don't have multi-file basically, and we have 4 serial files, and we want to run access those four files within this component. Okay, we can go to the partition, we can specify all these serial file one by one in this in this given space. Okay, the exact layout of I mean the path of these four files. Okay, within the partition. So when we click on the partition checkbox, all the 4 files can be. But all each files are serial files, but all together they would be creating 4 files. Okay, four-way multi-way basically. Now we have a dependency analysis related properties, EME datasets. So let's say we want to associate this dataset to the EME dataset which we are already created, or while checking this process would be creating. So whenever we check in, right? So if we say that associate this file with any EME dataset, or we can specify the path over here. This is the box where we can specify the EME dataset path. Okay, so the whenever you do it, so the by default path would be coming, and then you can alter, and you can decide from your side. Okay, and sometimes we don't want to create a different data sets, while because if we have a date in date part in this data set, right? So if we select like create or update any data set during dependency analysis, so whenever we are going to check in, okay, this graph, then depending upon that particular date, next new data set would be created. So we should avoid avoid creating different data set into the EME for a similar data set. So for that we create a dataset location and we give the default date, let's say YYYMMDD literally, and associate this dataset with that EME dataset. Always, we don't want to give the data. I mean the date part basically as it should be. I mean, or we can say that whenever we create the parameter in the parameter set, right, P set, so we can create that parameters and make that parameter dependent upon sandbox or a EME. So for EME, we can hard code that value for a single value, okay, and we can use that. So while checking the EME, the operating system and EME, the process would be deciding that we are going to use that EME dataset, that particular EME dataset, and this process would associate that this dataset with that dataset. Okay, so this part is solely for the dependency analysis purpose. So let's talk about one more component. Let's say we are. So I said right, the data would be data property would be for applicable for only for input and outputs. So we have talked about inputs, which is file and all, but in this snippet is for data table. Okay, Oracle table. Let's say. So if I have taken the example of Oracle. Now here, if we give the input table as a component, then similarly there will be a reusable dataset property within the data property. So we can create a dataset beforehand for a particular Oracle table, and if that particular Oracle table is going to be used for multiple places, then we can reuse that dataset. Okay, this is one way. And second property is configuration file. This is a database configuration file, this DBC file. For a particular database, there will be a DBC file associated with that. So we need to configure that DBC file. So whenever we connect to any database, right, from any programming language or from any tool, right, so we need some configuration to connect to that particular server and the credential and etc. Okay, so that DBC file contains all those properties. Okay, so we need to configure this configuration file. Okay, and depending upon particular database which we are going to use. So here I have taken the example of Oracle. There are multiple databases we can choose and select from this drop down box. Okay, and then there is a data location. So in data location, there you can specify the table name directly, the table name, or you can specify select statement if you want to use particular columns, only particular columns, then you can use table select statement, or you can specify the select statement within a file. So there are three options in the sort actually. I cannot show here because it's in static picture. Okay, so you can have source this drop down three options: table name, select statement in a file. And then if I selected source as a table name, then table name you need to specify. If I select source name as a select statement, then you will have a place to specify the select statement properly. Okay, and likewise. And then there is an interpretation. So the interpretation of the source, okay, and the table name. So the above property of will be applicable for the interpretation. If you interpret table name as a dollar interpretation, then you can do that. Otherwise, you can do PDL, or you can do this middle bracket, okay, dollar middle bracket, or you can do KSH. I mean, KSH also, okay, script interpretation or PDL, okay. So that you can pick and choose however you want to interpret this table. So how these different interpretation would be should be taken, that we are going to check in following video actually. So this is the about. So in next video, I'm going to talk about other properties like access properties and parameters and layout. And people were talking about what is the difference between propagate from neighbor and propagate through, and what are the different resolution or interpretation of a particular data, and how the port is going to be working, and what is the condition, how we can make the graph conditional. Okay, and what is the remove completed and what is the replace with flow, what is the difference between two. So these properties we are going to talk about in next videos. Okay, I'm going to create 2 or 3 videos on it actually, so that we can understand in and out of the particular component. Okay, thanks for watching, and please subscribe this channel. Okay.